Doctors, nurses of Reddit, what is the most obvious case of a patient faking it you have ever seen? Maybe not the most obvious in conventional terms, but perhaps the funniest story involving faking it from my work in prison healthcare. Every morning the prisoners get a chance to move, mostly, freely around the prison to go to their workplaces, or visits or healthcare if they are on daily meds, etc. Often if people are unwell they will come to healthcare and get a sick note so they can get a day off work without being penalized. Well, one day about 30-40 lads turn up at our healthcare window complaining of headaches, stomach aches, a few claiming to have vomited, although no confirmation from any of the officers. The really weird part was that every single one of them was from the same prison wing. We put in a security report worried something fishy was going on. Turned out that one of the guys on that wing had family appearing on the Jeremy Kyle show, UK's version of Jerry Springer, and all the guys wanted to stay in their cells and watch it. Had a patient complaining and passing. We heard them go plink in the bowl. Bladder stones. Meds galore. Of course. Those things hurt. We sent the stones for testing. Turned out the joke was on us. They came back as gravel. Even the lab said not usually found in human anatomy. No more drugs for you, lady. Little girl says she can't see a thing. Swears she needs glasses. Do any of your friends have glasses? Yeah. Chloe and Courtney have them. Biggie no. I can't see it. I put 0. 0 powered lenses on. Oh. I can see it now. Dot. Here. Mom. This is how blind your kiddo is. Here. My niece did this. My poor sister sat in the exam feeling like an awful parent. Thinking OMG. She can't see anything. No wonder she's struggling at school. How could we not realize? Until the optometrist had her try on the glasses that my niece insisted made her vision miraculously sharp. My brother's friend got glasses when they were like 6. When he tried on his friend's glasses, he was like, holy shit, this is what the world looks like, but my mom thought he was faking it to match his friend. Discovered he was not when he bombed the vision test at school. Faking being unconscious while peeking. Hard sternal rub. Presto. No longer unconscious. And very angry. My dad is a paramedic, and if the obviously faking patient somehow makes it through the sternal rub and the arm drop, he asks his partner to hand him the ocular needle, where his partner chimes in and says incredulously, the one that goes in the eyeball. Dot. Every time they miraculously come to. Back when I worked EMS and before I worked in the hospital, we had a little more freedom on how we would assess if people were faking. I had a guy that was pretending to be unconscious. Conveniently, I was orienting a newly hired EMT. I explained to the new EMT if this guy was unconscious his arm wouldn't move from where we placed it. I lifted his arm straight up in the air and he held it extended there for the entire 30-minute transport to the hospital. I was actually impressed he was that committed. I finally had to lower it to unload him from the back of the ambulance. I worked in a pain management clinic. It can be hard to diagnose and measure pain, but about 10% of the patients were clearly, unquestionably addicted to the meds. They all shared an attitude of fuck with my meds and I will cut your face. Anyone who said that the pain was 11 billion/10 was also immediately suspicious. I have had patients fake seizures to try and get admitted. They are usually careful to make sure everyone is watching before thrashing around on the stretcher. If you turn around, sometimes they stop and then will carefully peek to see if you are paying attention. After the reports of people peeking while faking seizures and unconsciousness in this thread, I'm pretty convinced no one ever mentally grows up past the age of 7. I think the thing I've learned is that if I ever needed to fake an illness, I should commit to it even though people might not be watching. Former EMT here. We had a patient who had a plethora of actual problems, but she would fake having seizures in order to get into the ER. I had heard dozens of ridiculous stories about this patient. So when I finally got called to her house for the first time, I was actually a little excited to see what she was all about. When we got there, I began setting up EKG leads and getting vitals from her while my partner was getting the stretcher out. My partner yells from the truck. Hey, be careful. Sometimes she likes to fall out of her seat when she has seizures. No more than a second after he says this, our patient just so happens to tip right out of her seat. I swear I almost saw her smile as she did it. NSFL, my friend told me this story and it is probably the worst account of Munchausen by proxy I ever heard of. Lady came in the ER with what was revealed later as fake IDs for her and her baby. Baby was puking blood, so she was taken in fast. Strangely, apart from the blood puking, the baby didn't seem that bad. CBC revealed normal results, which was definitely not expected. Doc found this suspicious and had the blood analyzed to reveal it wasn't the baby's. They finally realized the woman was making her baby drink her Diva cup to make her sick and get attention. Edit. I realized from some comments I haven't specified what happened in the end. The woman bolted with the child when she realized she was busted. They gave her description to the police. It's in their hands now. Obstetrics here. We had a 27-week pregnant girl come in claiming her waters had broken and she was in preterm labor. Tested with a dipstick, not positive for amniotic fluid, but she was in our HDU just in case. She went to the loo and came out with a soaking pad and tried the "my waters just broke" thing again. Yes, she'd run it under the tap. Then we had a lovely chat about how amniotic fluid and water do not smell at all alike, and she stopped doing it for a couple of weeks and started faking PV bleeds by putting lipstick on her pads instead. ER nurse here. So many people fake seizures in our waiting room in hopes of getting a room quicker. Most recently, funny one, I had a family member run over in a panic yelling, "He's having a seizure." I hopped out of my chair and took a couple quick steps only to witness a full-grown man leaning against a wall, shaking in a way that can only be described as a terribly uncoordinated dance move, whilst peeking at me to see if I looked worried as he shook his head back and forth. I stopped in my tracks and said he'll see a doctor soon with the most energy I could muster, and retreated to my other tasks in exasperation. Literally today. Tried to fake being non-responsive asleep. When you would go to pull their eyelids up to check their pupils, they would tense them up and not let you open them. If you tried to passively move any limb, they would put equal pressure against you in order to not move. Edit. Since this seems to be popular, I'll give an update plus a bonus story. The patient is a schizophrenic who is not compliant with their medications. They are catatonic. Now for the second story. Had a guy coming in at least twice a week for gallbladder attacks. It became obvious in short time that he was drug seeking, as he refused all drugs but the stronger opiates and would all of a sudden be in no pain and storm out when denied. After a while, when denied, he would vomit extremely loudly to show how serious this was. The only issue was, as he is holding the emesis bag to his mouth, you could see him bending his middle finger into his throat to stimulate his gag reflex. He continued this for close to 2 months before he realized he had seen almost every provider, and none were going to prescribe him opiates of any kind. When they are allergic to every painkiller except DD-Dilaudid, everyone in the room knows you're seeking Dilaudid and sadly addicted to narcotics. You can't be allergic to the other painkillers when some of them are in the exact same class of drug, just a lower dose. A patient who came in with seizures. It was questionable. Began to have one when the doctor was in the room, but noticed the patient's movement slow and they opened one eye a teeny bit to look at him and make sure he was watching, and then resumed shaking. Discharged after basic workup. I forgot where I read it here, but someone told the story of a doctor that when confronted with this exact scenario, would say, you know, it's not a real seizure because they are not pissing themselves. Then on cue, the patient would piss themselves. As someone who has exaggerated in a doctor's office, I know the other side of this. When going in for evaluation, I was told not to take any of my pain meds for a couple days before the appointment, so that the evaluator could get an accurate idea of how bad my condition actually was, and still is. Close bracket. On bad days, even heavy pain meds barely take the edge off. On good days, I don't need pain meds at all, and can live almost normally. Well, evaluation day was a good day. The evaluator saw bad day. If she hadn't, I would not have adequate resources to manage day to day. Sometimes you have to play the system to get what you really need. My mom is like that. Crazy pain tolerance. The doctors delayed her cancer treatment for a year because she kept telling them she was still going for 4-mile walks every day until one day she was admitted because she couldn't breathe. The doctor asked what level her pain was and she said it was a 4 out of 10. The doctor took her pulse and it was very high, which is a physiological response to pain. After explaining the pain scale to her, she thought 10 meant dead from pain and she was like, well, it's not going to kill me. They decided she was an 8. And her treatment started that week. BTW, the treatment worked and she is in remission. But her quality of life for the year prior would have greatly improved if she wasn't so stoic. I doubt this will get much attention at this point, but here goes. There was a patient who was in a wheelchair and reported having a spine injury that caused her to be paraplegic. She wanted a note to get disability. When the attending asked for her paperwork, she stood up out of the wheelchair, walked over to her backpack, got out the paperwork, and then sat back down. The look on all the medical professionals in the room was priceless. Just popping in to mention that while patients do fake it, and it happens with some regularity, especially in emergency rooms, I've encountered nurses in those areas who are convinced anyone without an obvious external injury is faking it. And that's just too broad a brush by a mile. To the point I've had nurses fail to pass patients' complaints of pain in a timely manner forward to me or others on the team. And in a few cases I've had a nurse walk up and expound on how much she thinks X patient is just there for drugs when I just looked at imaging or some other finding that would cause significant pain in just about anyone. Unquestionably, lots of people fake pain to get pain meds. This doesn't mean that everyone is faking. All that known past fakers should be instantly assumed to be faking this time. That's a good way to watch someone die in agony. Student midwife here. We get pregnant ladies who come in and claim to have had a bleed to get a free scan. Ask them to put in a new pad. No blood appears. Often saunter in completely casually. And the moment the scanner goes on, get their friend to take photos of the screen. What they fail to remember is because they just couldn't wait to see their baby. The woman who actually had a bleed and is scared witless is going to be waiting even longer. While faking it lady is going to be asking what the gender is. The other lady is just going to be begging them to tell her there's a heartbeat. Former L&D nurse here. Watching someone try to fake labor is quite funny. They will push on the contraction monitor to try and make it look like they're having contractions, but they look like squares, not hills like normal contractions. They never have them if you're in the room watching. Or they scream and holler while pushing on it. You can't fake labor. She thought she had a stroke and was completely paralyzed on her left side. But that was obviously not the case, as she periodically used her left hand to wipe her eyes. She was crying so hard she didn't even realize she was doing it, and continued to think she was paralyzed. I thought she was faking it at first, but it turns out the patient had conversion disorder, which means they thought they had a physical medical condition, and they were manifesting symptoms of one, but they actually didn't have it, and their brain was tricking them into thinking it. In essence, they weren't faking it, but they also weren't physically sick. Patient was a man with a fistula with copious output, created by himself by picking at an incision site. He had a controlled substance alert, was continuing to request his oxy every 4 hours on the dot, which I gave BC. Abdominal wounds are painful, and also requesting IV diluted. When I told him that I wasn't going to be giving him the IV diluted, he was very upset and tried to manipulate me into changing my mind. But I didn't cave. Later I enter into the room to see him happily picking at and extruding his own bowels. The ostomy bag that was catching the output was completed, filled with blood. The first thing he requests when I enter was the IV diluted. Probably one of the grossest things I've seen in the hospital. Also, you get a lot of requests to push the IV diluted quickly. Oh no. Really? All the other nurses do it that way and always commenting about what a waste of time it is to push it slowly. As a radiographer, my favorite is always the kids who are trying to milk some extra time off school. They'll come in with their helicopter parent flinching and sometimes crying as you move their arm into the required positions for the x-rays. Then use the affected arm to push themselves up out of the chair when they leave. Or if it's an ankle, they'll enter the x-ray room cringing and not putting it on the floor. Then we'll jump off the x-ray table. Nice try, kids. No plaster for you. I'm a midwife. We had a lady who would come in every few weeks with a new guy claiming she was in labor or experiencing a miscarriage. OFC, we had to take her seriously every time even though we knew she wasn't. So we'd scan her, etc. Only to tell her that she's not pregnant and isn't experiencing labor or a miscarriage. Thankfully, she's then turned to her guy and say that modern medicine is unreliable and he should just trust her instinct and will he help her raise the baby. The guy would often become afraid, how am I gonna raise this baby? What are the chances a scan is wrong, etc. We'd reassure him that 100% she isn't pregnant. They'd argue, break up, and she'd be back a few weeks later. Also, she'd come in by ambulance. Every time. Edit. For your information, this isn't the UK. Everything is free for her. We all pay taxes, which means that we're all entitled to free healthcare, so she isn't paying a penny for any of this. Also, we've tried to make psych referrals. But if the patient doesn't wish to engage, we can't force them to unless they are a danger to themselves or other people. For a little while I took disability applications. The level of faking was almost overwhelming. People hobbling into the office on crutches. People laying down on the floor because their back hurts too much to sit or stand. People crying because I just want to go back to work. It was a very small community and I would almost always see the claimants out and about with their symptoms non-existent. I remember one woman laying on the ground crying through the entire hour-and-a-half interview because the pain is just too much. We wrap up and she sobs as she hobbles to the door. I go to the store to grab some lunch 10 minutes later, and who is there walking around? Laughing and joking with her friend and carrying a watermelon? Not a doctor or anything related, but I went on a ton of ride-alongs with the local FD when I was in high school. It didn't take a doctor to see this girl was faking it. Bad. We got called out for a severely ill patient at the Cheesecake Factory. Most likely related to food poisoning. Somehow another unit from a different station got dispatched to the same call. Which was fine with us because, like I said, this girl was violently ill. When we got there, the other unit was already on scene, so we were turning around to leave when lo and behold another girl collapses to the ground yelling that she was having a seizure. Now, to say she was convulsing would be a drastic overstatement. At best she was just wiggling. It looked like an impression of a floppy fish. Not like someone having a seizure. The whole time we were walking over she'd peek to make sure we saw. But when we got over to her she stopped, sat up, and told us she didn't know she had seizures. Then, when she was done talking, she flopped over again and started wiggling on the ground some more. This happened the whole way to the hospital. Wiggle. Tell us stuff about her day. Wiggle. Ask if we were actually going to the hospital. Wiggle. Her vitals were also completely normal, as was every other thing about her. Before, during, and after all of her mini seizures. She was an odd one. I remember my kidney stone about 2 years ago. Most pain I've ever been in. And at 23. So a bit uncommon from what I gather. I do remember the doctor being skeptical about it at first. They sent me home with pain meds. Oxy. Since it should have passed in a few days. Week later I'm back and now they are genuinely skeptical till I get a CT scan. Still there. Same thing. Home with meds. Oxy again. Another week I'm back and this time it's much worse. Turns out the 3mm stone didn't pass and was now stuck and I got an infection. Got maybe 3 shots to the stomach to prevent blood clotting. Lots of blood taken. Etc. Reading these stories of people faking this stuff pisses me off. FCK them. The one good thing came from the stone. I don't have a phobia of needles anymore. I had a patient that tried to tell me he was suffering from frequent urination. That's fine. Probably nothing severe. He might just be drinking too many fluids. But when I asked how many times per day he was urinating, he claimed it was 11 times per day. I suspected that he was lying, but I decided to do my due diligence. I informed the patient, who resembled a tall child, that I would have to perform a prostate examination. He appeared reluctant, but he complied. At first, when he had bent over the table, he supported himself with his hands, as though he thought he had a little dignity left. I told him to bend over further and use his elbows for support instead of his hands. I performed the procedure, and as I suspected, found nothing wrong with his prostate. However, I think that when I pulled my finger out, he thought that he was defecating, because the only thing that has ever come out of his anus were feces. As I extracted my finger, he screamed, "I'm sorry," with genuine fear and remorse. I left the tall child shortly after, but my assistant, who was always too blessed to be stressed and appeared to be a big fan of Batman, informed me that the patient had passed out during his blood test. After awakening, he drearily informed my assistant that he needed to speak to me, because he sometimes got nervous on airplanes. I think it was all a lie. To get drugs. You know. Like a crime. Paramedic here. Got sent to a car accident between a pedestrian and a car. A really BS one. The car scratched him at best. It was like 4 kilometers per hour. PT kept telling us that the other driver broke his leg, complaining about 10/10 pain in his leg, telling us that this is the worst pain he had ever felt. No pain can ever be as painful. Dude didn't even have a scratch on him. Going through a bumpy road. A thing that usually is a nightmare for people with broken limbs. Hell. For any kind of pain in the limbs. And yet, not a word from him. Didn't faze him a tad bit. Told the doctors at the ER that the only thing that's hurting him is his insurance. Not a doctor nurse but a personal anecdote. When I was younger I got sick fairly frequently and so my parents were always extra cautious. I also really hated school and would do anything to avoid going. So when I was in grade 3 or 4, I faked being sick. No symptoms of anything but I just said I really don't feel good and acted really weak and got away with not going to school for a week. In between we went to clinics where I continued the act but they couldn't figure out what was wrong and just recommended rest. Finally after a week my parents decided to take me to a pediatrician. His office was great. It had a bunch of toys, posters and was a very child-friendly environment. He told my parents to wait outside and examined me. He was very friendly. Made jokes, showed me around, etc. He then left the room and I was there alone. At that point I snapped. I forgot all about the bigger picture and started playing around. His office door had a little window where you could see inside and after a few minutes the doctor told my parents to take a look. My entire act was over and everyone realized that I had been faking it the whole time. The doctor figured me out and dismantled my plan within 10 minutes lol. 20 years ago I was completing my EMT certification. And as part of the process I had to spend a couple of nights working as a general purpose gopher and assistant in an emergency room. Around 2 AM one evening a guy was brought in. Suspected drug overdose. Apparently he was a frequent and regular customer. And the nurses were clearly irritated that he was back. They were even more irritated that he was unconscious. Because several were convinced that he was faking it. This grizzled old battle axe said I'll find out if he's faking it. And told me to come give her a hand. I stood there and watched in stunned silence as that nurse chuckled and shoved a catheter up that poor bastard's CCK that was roughly the same size and diameter as a garden hose. I wanted to crawl under the furniture. But she didn't flinch and neither did he. So it was concluded that he probably wasn't faking it this time. I've been slightly terrified of nurses ever since. I'm a vet so I don't know if this counts, but one time an old school friend who I kept in touch with swung by and paid me to patch up a pretty bad cut on his chest. I knew they were up to something bad that had led to this obvious knife wound, but they said they were out camping hunting and that they were drunk and didn't really remember. I helped as best I could with the stitches and only ever saw him one time after that buying a bagel from a food truck, but hey, $20 is $20. I got my hand stitched up by a vet. I was holding my cat when the vet turned on some clippers. The cat decided it was time to go and use my hand as a launching pad. Big gash from the rear claw between my knuckles. The vet was shocked. And I think worried. She told me I should go immediately to the ER. But then offered to stitch me up. Saved me a lot of trouble and some $. I was her first human patient.